Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Carrie Jones, Medical Director for Precision Analytical. We are the creators of the Dutch test. Thank you so much for having me today so I can do this webinar on this case that I think you're going to find really interesting. This is the clinical case of a perimenopausal woman with depression and anxiety. And what we're going to do is we're going to break down how hormones, especially hormones of a perimenopausal woman, and certain organic acids collide. So let's get started. We're going to skip through a couple of these intro slides. All right, let's jump into the case history. 48-year-old woman. She said she's always had a bit of depression and anxiety, and now she feels like it's getting worse, especially in the morning. She wakes stressed out. She used to sleep pretty well, and now she finds she can't. She wakes up at night, or she can't fall asleep, or sometimes both. She's having more hot flashes, sometimes daily, sometimes they'll skip, and her cycles are more irregular. So when she does get them, she has PMS, she has menorrhagia, which is heavy bleeding, mastalgia, which is tender breasts. And when she skips months, because of course she's 48 years old and perimenopausal, she says, that's when I notice I'm more depressed. I have a lot more hot flashes and a lot more brain fog. Her stress is very high. She is a high school teacher here in the United States. She is married and she has 2 kids in school. And she says, I'm low energy most days. I need coffee to function. I need coffee to get going, and I need coffee when I'm at school teaching. She tries to be gluten-free and is about 80% successful, except what she ends up doing is just skipping lunch entirely because of her teacher schedule, which a lot of teachers we find will do this. They eat very little during the day, and then they'll snack quite a bit, or they'll eat a big dinner, or they'll eat all night, which is of course not good for the blood sugar. And she said she doesn't hydrate that well. Other than coffee, she can't drink that much water through the day because, again, she's a teacher and she doesn't have a whole lot of bathroom ability when she's in class all day long. Of note, her mother's sister, so her aunt, had estrogen receptor positive breast cancer that was diagnosed when she was 50 years old. So when the aunt was 50 years old. And she herself, she's 48, so she's concerned about estrogen. All right, so just as a reminder about the way that women's hormones rise and fall, and make sure that we're all on the same page when I talk about a perimenopausal woman. This is the rise and fall of a normal woman with normal cycles. And you'll see that this is what we call premenopausal. So this is someone in her teens, 20s, 30s, maybe early 40s, where things are just still like pretty normal, pretty consistent. I mean, this is ideal. You get that up-down pattern of estrogen, progesterone, and of course, the brain hormones FSH and LH. When a woman moves into menopause, everything flattens out. So FSH and LH rise. They're the higher levels there. And estrogen and progesterone are at the very, very, very bottom of that rectangle. They drag along the bottom. And FSH and LH are essentially coming from the brain to the ovary and yelling at the ovary, please, please make some hormone. And the ovaries are like, nope, we are done. We are postmenopausal. We don't have to do this anymore, and we're not gonna. And so it only ekes out a teeny tiny bit. So this is premenopause and postmenopause. Now, what does perimenopause looks like? Well, perimenopause is kind of chaotic, as you can see. And I think if those of you who've heard me lecture before for the group, I've used these slides before because they're just so descriptive. They're so visual of what a perimenopausal woman goes through. It's just sheer chaos. Some days or weeks or months are good, and then the next days or weeks or months are very symptomatic, and she just can't get a handle on it until she finally moves into menopause. So what we're going to focus on today is that middle rectangle, that perimenopausal state where things are just going up and down and kind of in chaos. So I did some testing on her, and it turns out she had 2 months of regular menstrual cycles. So I said, you know what, we're gonna have you collect the Dutch test, which is what we're talking about today. And I had her collect around day 19, 20, or 21. Again, I was going for that luteal or luteal phase. I wanted to try to find her peak in progesterone if she had it. I ran her thyroid, her full thyroid panel, and I ran iron markers on her, and they were functionally normal, so no problems there. I did run her vitamin D and her glucose and her insulin, and I do have the American ranges, so I apologize, but her vitamin D is low at 27. The range is 30 to 100. Her fasting glucose is definitely hedging up there. You know, anything over 100 to 125 in the United States is considered pre-diabetic, and she's at 97. And then her fasting insulin is at 9. Now, the range is rather large. The range is 2.6 to 24.9, but a fasting insulin, most functional practitioners, if you're looking at these US ranges, want them below 9. Sometimes they want them below 7, and sometimes they even, you'll see below 5. Now, she's, again, right at the upper end. She's at 9 for her insulin and 97 for her glucose. So we know blood sugar's a problem for her, but we know she's skipping meals because she just doesn't have the time when she's teaching. Okay, so before we jump into the hormones, though, I want to just touch on like what is Dutch? When I say a Dutch test, what do I mean? Well, it's an acronym. I often get asked, "Are you testing for Dutch ancestry?" I'm like, "No, no. It stands for dried urine test for comprehensive hormones." So it's a dried urine test. It's not a blood test. It's not in part a saliva test, although we can add what's called a cortisol awakening response to it. But our flagship test, which is called the Dutch Complete, is just urinating on pieces of filter paper throughout the day. And what you get with the Dutch test are all the metabolites. So you'll get your androgen metabolites, you'll get your DHEAS, your testosterone, but then you'll get your DHT, and you'll get your androsterone, or some people pronounce it androsterone, and your etiochalanolone. You'll get your estrogen metabolites, so your phase 1, your phase 2 estrogen detoxification. You get your progesterone metabolites, which we're going to talk about that as well. Your metabolized cortisol and cortisone. Your free cortisol and cortisone. You get your pattern, your up-down pattern through the day. And then, of course, the Dutch, we call them Dutch extras. This is where you get your organic acids, your melatonin, and your oxidative stress marker, which is called 8-OH-DG. And we're going to include these as we go through this case and walk through treatment. So for those of you who are new to dried urine testing, or what we call spot urine testing, and you're curious as to the research behind it, there is good research. One, this is comparing dried urine or spot urine testing to saliva. So Burgess in 2005 and 2006 showed that if you do a saliva test throughout the day, such as with cortisol, that dried urine and spot urine matches up really well. I know that some of you are doing things like 24-hour urine, or we call liquid urine, and of course the dried urine and the liquid urine matches up quite well here as well when you look at this graph. And then I have it again, the 24-hour correlation specifically for like testosterone as an example, estradiol for an example, one of the progesterone metabolites, which is called beta-pregnanediol, which is the most common progesterone metabolite in the human body. But interestingly, it's the alpha metabolite, the A-pregnanediol, which we will talk about later, that has a lot more to do with symptom relief. So we'll get there when we talk about her progesterone results. But this is just to show, for those of you who are using 24-hour, that dried urine actually correlates really, really well. I know a number of you are using serum testing, and you'll say, well, how does dried urine correlate with serum? And it actually correlates really quite well. And Precision Analytical, the owners of the Dutch test, we're actually working on publishing data that shows that dried urine results and serum results on the same day have a really great correlation. Unfortunately, publishing research takes a lot of time, a lot of expertise, and a lot of money. So be patient, and as soon as we have that published or more information on that, we will definitely announce that. But it does correlate for those of you using serum. All right, let's look at her results in particular. So we looked at her progesterone, which is on the left, and her estrogen markers on the right. And we're going to break all this down. So on the left, her progesterone, we have the B-pregnanediol and the A-pregnanediol. So in urine, there's very little progesterone, but we get these metabolites. And like I was saying earlier, the B-pregnanediol, the beta, is the most abundant in the human body, male or female. But it's the A-pregnanediol, the alpha-pregnanediol. That's the one that keeps going down the alpha pathway. It turns into something called allo, A-L-L-O. That crosses the blood-brain barrier and touches on GABA, your GABA A receptors. And as you know, GABA is your big anti-anxiety, calming neurotransmitter in your brain. So women will find as they're losing out on progesterone, if they're not ovulating as they get into menopause, their anxiety goes up. And one of the big reasons is they miss out on this alpha, this A-pregnanediol, supporting their GABA in their brain. So there's a pretty key connection there. On the right-hand side, you'll see her estrogens, her E1 or estrone is borderline high. Her estradiol is outright elevated at 4.8. And then her estriol, E3, is elevated at 23.4. So let's break this down a little bit. Does this mean she's estrogen dominant every month? Of course not. We know that she's skipping cycles. We know she's 48 years old. So if you have a woman who is perimenopausal in your clinic and she says, some months I feel estrogen dominant, and what she may say to you is, I have tender breasts, I have heavy periods, I'm really moody. And other months she feels estrogen deficient. So she says, I'm having hot flashes, I'm having night sweats, I'm having bone aches and brain fog. It's because, remember, go back to that slide where I have the rectangular picture where it's just chaos. Some months are going to be high, some months are going to be low, and some months are going to be normal. So we're going to address, like, what do those high estrogen states and low estrogen states cause, especially for some of her brain symptoms like depression and anxiety. So just be aware that is that HPO, that hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, is going up and down and in and out. Her estrogen is not estrogen dominant every month. So we look at her phase 1 detox. So the estrogens are kind of the main estrogens are kind of faded out, and now we look into phase 1. So phase 1 can go down three pathways: the 2-OH, which is called hydroxy, so 2-OHE1, the 4-OH or 4-hydroxy, and the 16-OH or the 16-hydroxy. Now, I have it in quotes, but 2-OH is generally considered the quote good pathway. It's like the kind of better pathway to head down. Whereas the 4 pathway, if it does not go through phase 2, if it does not get methylated, it can continue on down this pathway that may lead to DNA mutations and potentially cancer. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. And then the 16 pathway is often associated with cancer, and you'll hear the 2-16 ratio quite a bit. That actually has been largely debunked. 16 itself is a proliferator. So if you're 16 dominant, you may have tender swollen breasts. You may have heavy periods because you have a lot of tissue. You may have clots because you have a lot of tissue. And if you happen to have breast cancer, then in your 16 dominant, it can cause that cancer to proliferate. And so that's why we look at this, the way that we look at this 16. And remember, these phase 1 metabolites, as they're called, they can recirculate in the body. And of course, like I said, they can be quite damaging. So we want them to move through. But if you want to know your estrogen metabolism, if you're really trying to, learn estrogen detox and wrap your head around this, I call this my stick figure chart. I designed this chart about a year ago as I was just really trying to get a visual on how estrogen works and which pathways we want to go down, and then some of the genetics involved. And so you'll see everything in green is good. Everything in green is ideal, and everything in red is less than ideal. And then I made it even more simple. I gave you smiley faces and frowny faces. So obviously you want to have your clients and patients head towards the smiley face. So your estrogens go through that 2, that 4, that 16, that's on the left-hand side. And then as they move across the right-hand side to the frowny and smiley faces, you can see the various options they have. So if you follow the red pathway, that 4-OH going down the red pathway becomes what's called a quinone with a Q. And then it keeps moving and it becomes an adduct. And then you get the increased risk for DNA mutation once adducts form. There are 2 genes on that pathway, that 2 main genes that create enzymes that can be quite helpful. One is quinone reductase, and one is GST, which is, of course, with glutathione. And so for those of you into genetics, supporting glutathione production and supporting quinone reductase can be really helpful. Otherwise, we're looking at the gene COMT primarily, the COMT. Everyone thinks it's MTHFR, and MTHFR has a minor role when you're looking at the methionine cycle, but it's actually COMT that moves the 4-OH to the 4-methoxy or the 2-methoxy. So what do I mean by, with breast cancer? Think back, I said her aunt had developed breast cancer, estrogen dominant breast cancer at 50. And so when we look at this research study, they show the 4-OH is on the left-hand side, and as it goes across, it becomes something that's called a depurinating addict. And what happens is depurinating means it breaks off. So it will bind to DNA and break off and leave a hole. And then your DNA repair system goes, ah, crap, there's a hole, and it has to go in and fix it. Well, if you have more addicts creating more holes than you have a healthy DNA repair system, the DNA repair system gets overwhelmed and it cannot fix all the holes, or it has to speed up, and the increased risk for mutation is there, leading to cancer. So if we go back to that chart with the big fat red arrow, you will see it says depurinating addict. You can see right on the red pathway where we're looking for that. So if we keep going though, right, we go from phase 1 to phase 2, and I was saying it has to do with COMT primarily, and it's the active methylation for phase 1 into phase 2. And we look at to become a methoxy. So this is 2-methoxy-E1, and it's a ratio. It's how, when you go from your 2-OH to your 2-methoxy, how fast or how slow is that moving? And in this example, she's way too slow, which means that her estrogens are recirculating, and we don't want that. So what are the cofactors for COMT? Again, COMT, C-O-M-T, we're not talking about MTHFR. So the two primary cofactors are magnesium and SAM, which many people may know SAMe from the supplement. But SAM is created on the methionine cycle where homocysteine circles back around again to methionine, and then methionine makes SAM. SAM goes out and does its job and then comes back, and then the circle goes round and round again. So by creating SAM, you have to have that entire methylation cycle to work. And that's where, when you're looking there, that like MTHFR, folate can play a role, B12 can play a role, things like that. But really, it's ultimately SAM and magnesium that are working for COMT. And so we're looking at methyl donors and nutrients. And when I say that, I'm thinking things like, supplementing with methionine or choline, giving SAM itself, folate if they need it. Apparently choline is so important, I put it twice. TMG, which is trimethylglycine, P5P, which is the active form of B6, methyl B12, all these things that help that methionine cycle go round and round, just so you can make healthy levels of SAM to help COMT, to help your estrogens. That's your ultimate goal. So my analogy is always this when people say, I'm kind of confused on this phase 1, phase 2. What do you mean? So phase 1, when you're looking at the 2, the 4, the 16, picture a bathtub. Picture a clawfoot bathtub, because why not, right? Let's make it beautiful. And the water filling up the tub is the type of water that you want to correlate with your phase 1 metabolites. What kind of metabolite is it? Is it the right water, right? Is it the 2 water, the 4 water, the 16 water? Is it coming in fast? Is it coming in slow? That's the phase 1. Now, phase 2 is the ability of your drain. Is your drain open? Is it closed? Is it kind of open? Is it open wide, but it needs to be wider because so much water is coming in? So that's how you need to sort of view this in your head. What's the water look like, and how fast is it draining out? So in this particular case of this 48-year-old, her E2 or estradiol is elevated. Her E1, her estrone, is on the upper end of the range. And then her 4-OH is too elevated, so that's phase 1 detox. And she's not moving efficiently enough into the phase 2, so she's getting this backup in her system, causing that 4 to recirculate. And of course, we don't want that to happen. And then now she's estrogen dominant, especially on this month that she collected, and the months where she's, gearing up to have a period, she's probably rather estrogen dominant. Hence the reason she says, I have PMS, I have, heavy periods, I have tender breasts. Like, of course you do. You're swimming in estrogen, unfortunately. We need to work on that on your bathtub. That's what we need to do. Now, other information about her, I ran her organic acids. So on organic acids, melatonin is a problem. Her melatonin is below range. It's circled there in red. And as we saw in the beginning, sleep, either not able to fall asleep or stay asleep, is a big problem for her. And then as you look down, the other circle in red is what's called xanthuronate. The higher xanthuronate is, the lower her B6 is. So she's either not getting enough B6, or she doesn't have the cofactors for B6. She's not absorbing her B6. There's something going on with her B6 that she can't utilize in it, and it's causing problems. We ran some other organic acids that are included in the Dutch test. They're called neurotransmitter metabolites. And you will see her homovinylate, which is a primary dopamine metabolite, or HVA is what we shorten it to, was above range. And as we know, there is a potential that this may mean her dopamine is also high. Well, when you have elevated dopamine, you tend to be more anxious. It's a catecholamine that can cause alertness, anxious, restlessness, things like that. And of course, in the morning, she wakes up stressed out and anxious. Next down, you'll see her vinylmendalate, which is VMA, or her norepinephrine epinephrine, as you guys call noradrenaline and adrenaline. And it's below range, which means either her adrenal medulla is not making her adrenaline, or she's not converting from dopamine into noradrenaline and adrenaline. And that can be some nutrient deficiencies that I'm going to talk about in the treatment. And lastly is her serotonin metabolite, her 5-HIAA. It's below range. Potentially, it can lead to depression. It means her serotonin is low. And we know depression, especially as she gets into menopause, perimenopause, she says, I'm starting to feel more depressed and I'm starting to feel more anxious and I'm tired all the time. And so when we look at this, I'm like, yeah, wow, this really correlates with your symptoms. Let's do something about it. Let's help you. What I want to touch on, though, is estrogen's effect on some of these markers. So remember, you've got a lot of serotonin in your brain, but not nearly as much as you have in your gut. You have 90% of your serotonin is in your gut, and only about 1% of your serotonin that you make is in your brain, except what's in your brain is very critical, right? It's very crucial to things, to your mood and to your habits. Well, what you may not realize is estrogen has to bind to ERB, that's estrogen receptor beta. And when estrogen binds to estrogen receptor beta, you get an upregulation of the mRNA to make tryptophan hydroxylase. Why do you care? Well, tryptophan hydroxylase is the rate limiting step to get from tryptophan over to 5-HTP. So I have serotonin in parentheses just to indicate this is the serotonin pathway. So if you don't have enough estrogen, if your woman does not have enough estrogen and she says, I'm depressed, there's a real good chance she's not making 5-HTP, and that cannot further go on to make serotonin. And then remember, serotonin can keep going on to make melatonin. Here it is. What if she has high estrogen, right? She's high estrogen this month. I know she's not high estrogen every month, but this month she is. Well, tryptophan actually can go down two pathways. So one, of course, is the serotonin pathway, and only about 5% of tryptophan heads down this pathway. The other 95% goes down what's called a kynurenine pathway, and kynurenine is important because that's where you make your NAD. Super important for things like your mitochondria. But if you look back up at your serotonin can then make the metabolite 5-HIAA, and it can make melatonin. Well, we just saw her 5-HIAA was low. We just saw that her melatonin is low. So pretty good chance her serotonin is low. Now, only 5% goes down this pathway. So if it dips at all, if it goes to 4% or 3%, 2%, women are going to feel it, right? They're going to feel even more depressed and have more insomnia and more issues. What will divert? Well, I have it written in red on the left-hand side. Excess estrogen. On the months that she has high estrogen, she's definitely excess. Her estrone is borderline high, her estradiol is high, her 4 is high, and she can't methylate very well. So on those months, she's shifting away from serotonin, all because of her estrogen. Now, other reasons include cortisol. High cortisol will shift away. Inflammation, any kind of inflammation, whether it's muscle, bone, joint, gut, neuro, it doesn't matter. Any kind of inflammation, infection, um, autoimmune, Lyme, that will all shift it away. And then lastly is LPS. LPS is an abbreviation for lipopolysaccharide, and that happens in gram-negative bacteria in the gut. So LPS in the gut. So basically, it's what inflammation, right? Like it really should all be under the subheading of inflammation, because these are like stress, estrogen, LPS. Man, these really can drive up inflammatory cytokines, and the body goes, wow, we do not need serotonin right now. What we need is NAD, and it will shift down. Okay, we talked about estrogen. What about our progesterone? Well, I said this already, but I just wanted to hit home again in case you don't know. Progesterone, especially the alpha pregnanediol, and pregnenolone convert into the neurosteroid allo. There it is, ALLO, and that crosses the blood-brain barrier. Now, many people falsely assume pregnenolone, the supplement, will raise progesterone. It does not. It does not, because it goes the brain route. It converts into allo, and that crosses the blood-brain barrier. People will say, well, I take pregnenolone and I feel better. I'm like, I know, because you're working from the brain down. You're not directly converting pregnenolone into progesterone. The reason for that is that hormone conversion happens in the mitochondria of the cell itself. So for example, if a breast cell needs progesterone, it will pull cholesterol into the cell, into the mitochondria, and keep going from there. Pregnenolone happens to be a step on the way, which is why we all see it on the steroid pathway and think, oh, if I give pregnenolone, I can raise progesterone. It's not the way the cell works at a mitochondrial level, but pregnenolone is very helpful from the brain down. Aloe, of course, like I said, it's a positive modulator at GABA A. GABA A is your anxiety, your insomnia, your stress, seizure for some people. And so this is why progesterone and pregnenolone can really be helpful here. And what's great on the Dutch test is we absolutely report the A-pregnanediol level for everybody, male or female. Some companies just report the B, the beta-pregnanediol, and miss out on the A. And oh my gosh, but so many women skip their period or hit perimenopause or menopause, and anxiety is a big deal for them. So it's important to know what their A is doing, what their alpha is doing. All right, what about her adrenals? She says she's super tired, right? Especially in the morning. She kind of lives off coffee to get going. And you'll see both of her cortisol markers, her metabolized cortisol and her free cortisol are low. So metabolized cortisol is kind of her ability to make cortisol. How much cortisol does she have in total? And then, of course, the free is that 5% or less that's free floating around and able to bind and be active. And it's pretty low. And cortisol comes from the adrenal gland, just like noradrenaline or norepinephrine and adrenaline or epinephrine do. And her VMA was low. So we've got like a pretty big fatigue issue here right out of the HPA axis. The brain is not telling the adrenals, not giving that signal to make these hormones for some reason. So what did I do to address her case? All right, so obviously, basic treatments first. Address the cause. Don't call me and say, "Hey, here's her estrogen. Like, what supplement should I do?" I'm going to ask you, like, well, what did you do for everything else? Her diet, her lifestyle, her sleep, her blood sugar, because that is so critical. So for her, I explained perimenopause to her and the chaoticness of hormones. I was like, look, I am not saying it's fair or it's fun for perimenopause to happen, but it is common and your symptoms you experience are common, and we are going to work on this. I explained to her that by skipping meals, even though I understood she's a teacher and eating can be really difficult, it's greatly affecting her blood sugar and her insulin. She's probably fluctuating between hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia, so up and down. And of course, that's freaking out the HPA axis, right? And it's putting her in a fight or flight sometimes, and other times she's feeling all burnt out and she's crashed and she's tired. And so again, we did these adrenals on one day, but the adrenals can fluctuate just like anything else. Although I bet she's pretty much, I bet her cortisols are often on the low end most of the time, given her symptoms. But glucose or cortisol, excuse me, cortisol is called a glucocorticosteroid for a reason. Your cortisol's primary job is to manage your glucose. It's a glucocorticosteroid, which means, listeners, if you do not fix your blood sugar or the blood sugar of your clients first, you will never, not ever, heal the HPA axis. You have to fix their blood sugar and insulin dysregulation. You have to. It's what cortisol's primary job is. Moving on, I reviewed it and said, hey, look, let's try to get you hydrated a little bit more in the day. Dehydration is a stressor to the body, and it's pretty simple. I know you're a teacher, but let's just try to do the best we can. I reminded her about sleep hygiene. How many teachers do we know work late? They're up on their computer, they're reading papers, they're grading tests, they're putting together plans for the next day. So they handle their family, they handle kids all day long. They come home, they're with their family, they put their kids to bed, and then they get to work. And now she's all revved up and she's got all that blue light exposure from her phone, from her computer. She's working and it suppresses her melatonin. So I said, okay, I understand what you do for a living, but just be more conscious of it. Try to get off your computer at a decent hour. Try to give yourself some wind down time. Don't wind up. Maybe buy those blue light blocking glasses and wear those pretty regularly once the sun goes down to try to fix that melatonin. I did do extra testing for her on copper and vitamin C. Now, one of the things we didn't talk about was all the nitty gritty when it comes into HVA and VMA. So to convert from HVA into VMA, you need copper and vitamin C. Those are the cofactors. And her HVA was high and her VMA was low. So while it absolutely could be adrenal, it may also be a nutrient issue. So I'm actually waiting on those labs for her. I don't have those, but just keep in mind if you see on organic acid testing when you're doing the Dutch test that if the HVA is higher and the VMA is lower, number one, you should consider doing serum copper and check them for vitamin C. But we also know vitamin C is a required nutrient by the adrenal glands, right? It's along with B5, pantothenic acid. Vitamin C is super important. So sometimes I'll be honest, sometimes I test and sometimes I'm like, you know what, you're an adrenal mess anyway. Your HPA axis is not that great. And, depending on the season, maybe if it's cold and flu season, I just go ahead and put them on vitamin C because humans cannot make their own vitamin C. We're one of the few mammals that cannot. And so sometimes I just do that. I do not put people on copper just like I do vitamin C. I do test a serum copper because I do really, you have to be careful with copper, and especially in relation to zinc. But we hear a lot about zinc deficiency and not as much about copper, but it's actually a little more common than you might think. All right, more treatments. So she says, you know what? We're talking about COMT and all these other things. I want to do that genetic test. I'm going to buy that genetic test online, and then we're going to go from there. So obviously, I don't have her genetics test results back yet, but I think that's great. We can look deeper into things like her COMT and her MAO. Now remember, COMT and MAO do break down dopamine into HVA and noradrenaline and adrenaline into VMA. And then MAO breaks serotonin down into 5-HIAA. So people who have issues there may find that their levels are lower because it's more of a genetic issue. We did add in 5,000 IU of vitamin D because her vitamin D levels were low. And at the time, and where this patient lives is in the Pacific Northwest, which she lives in Portland, Oregon. And for those of you who are geography challenged, Oregon is the state above California but below Washington, and obviously below Canada. So we don't get much sunshine. We're not like California, which primarily gets a lot of sun. We're a lot rainier than that. So she doesn't get a lot of vitamin D from the sun. So I went ahead and supplemented her. And then lastly, I said, we're going to go ahead and put you on 100 milligrams of 5-HTP for serotonin. Your estrogen's high sometimes and low sometimes. It's totally messing up your 5-HTP production. Therefore, you can't make serotonin. You're depressed and you can't sleep. Let's just start with 100, and you can go up from there. Most women, do fairly well at 50 to 100, and usually cap out somewhere in the 300 to 400 range for 5-HTP. But we started at 100, and we'll go from there. I did put her on progesterone. I can prescribe progesterone as a naturopathic physician, which is what I am here in the States. And so I had her do 100 milligrams at night. Why? Because I was trying to capitalize on that alpha pregnanediol. I wanted to see if I could use that progesterone to go down the alpha pathway and improve her GABA, that's improving her anxiety symptoms and her stress symptoms. Now, some people may say, well, what about pregnenolone? Would you put her on pregnenolone? Sure, absolutely. You could put her on pregnenolone. The only difference is pregnenolone does not counter estrogen. And so when I'm trying to find the right estrogen progesterone balance, you need progesterone. Progesterone's what does it. Because remember, pregnenolone doesn't raise progesterone, which is what everybody thinks. And so it's helpful for the brain, helpful for anxiety. Absolutely. It can be helpful for the HPA axis, but pregnenolone is not going to counter estrogen. To my knowledge. So we went ahead and used real progesterone for her. Plus she's having some hot flashes, often. And while it could be the up and down of estrogen for sure, that rise and fall, having a steady state of progesterone may actually help balance her hot flashes as an aside. Estrogen detox options. Well, she has several. So there's DIM or diindolylmethane or indole-3-carbinol. So indole-3-carbinol needs really healthy levels of stomach acid to break apart. And when it breaks apart, one of its metabolites is DIM, diindolylmethane. So I tend to use more just DIM and less indole-3-carbinol because, of course, not all my patients have healthy stomach acid levels. But just so you know, DIM and indole-3-carbinol do shift estrogens towards the 2 pathway and away from the 4 pathway, and even inadvertently away from the 16 pathway, which is nice as well. But it does primarily work on the 2-4. Now, be careful. I have written there, my concern, DIM lowers E1 and E2 out of circulation. Well, on the months that she has low estrogen because she's skipping cycles, DIM might make her feel worse. She might say, some months I do DIM and feel great, and other months my hot flashes are worse. It's because her estrogen's going up and down. So on high estrogen months, DIM works great. On low estrogen months, it worsens her hot flashes. So some women have to go on and off DIM depending on their symptoms for that reason, because you can't test every month. You kind of have to go off of symptoms, and usually they know when they're bouncing around. Other options, though, if you think to yourself, I don't want to do DIM or indole-3 carbinol, that's too much. That's too difficult to track. Well, go back to that quinone reductase. Go back to my stick figure chart. And you can use things like sulforaphane, which is found in really high concentrations in broccoli sprouts. Make sure they're organic broccoli sprouts, right? Organic broccoli sprouts. And what that does is it activates quinone reductase, which then pushes the 4 that's going down the quinone pathway back to the beginning again, so that it can be methylated, which is, fantastic. And then it also activates NRF2 and ARE, which are phase 2 enzymes. So that's fantastic. Get that phase 2 moving, and does support glutathione through the GST gene. So broccoli sprouts and sulforaphane are pretty awesome. And then if you're like, you know what, I want to do everything, what else can I do? You can do comp support or methylation support. So I'm waiting on her genetics. I can't get real specific with her, unfortunately, until I have those back. So I'm just using a generic blend, and the blend I was using has B2 and of course B6, because her xanthioneate's high, which means she needs B6. So I want to make sure to get her P5P. I want the active form for her. A little B12, it was methyl B12. It had a little folate in it, and it had TMG, which is trimethylglycine. So again, just working on that methionine cycle to try to help her SAM make her, help her COMT enzyme to help her estrogens. So that's just sort of a band-aid until we get our genetics back. But if you guys want to know, like, what are all of your detox options, here you go. I broke it apart for you. So phase 1 detox problems, phase 2 detox problems. What can you do for quinone reductase? What can you do for GST and glutathione? This isn't the end all be all list, but it is definitely like where could you start? And you could look here and work on diet, and you can work on supplements and nutrients and sort of piece it together. And then lastly, there's some gut intestinal microbiome support that we on the Dutch test, we don't look at gut or intestinal stuff, but obviously the gut has a huge influence on what you absorb and what you take in and what your nutrient markers are going to be and how you clear estrogen. So if you're having a lot of gut issues, then you may make a lot of beta glucuronidase, which means you're setting your estrogens free for recirculation. Calcium D-glucarate, the supplement, counters that. It keeps your estrogens all bound up so that you can excrete it out of the colon, which is fantastic. So for those of you maybe who are doing other like stool testing, check the beta glucuronidase levels. That may give you some estrogen insight as well. Her adrenal treatment, of course, because her cortisol levels were so low. Well, I decided, I was like, I'm going to focus your fatigue, your anxiety, specifically with the 5-HTP and her progesterone, plus all the things she can do at home. Sleep hygiene, blood sugar balancing, because that's cortisol's primary job, and hydration. I did decide to give her just a general adaptogenic mix. She is a teacher after all. School is 9 months of the year here, so she can't quit. She doesn't want to quit. We have to wait till summer, and where she can work a little harder on repairing herself. And so we basically use an adaptogenic adrenal mix as a band-aid to keep her going, while she can make these baby steps throughout the school year. I did have her switch to a light-based alarm clock instead of a traditional alarm clock or an alarm clock on her phone. I had her buy one of those kind that would gradually light up the room. And what that does is it helps stimulate what's called your cortisol awakening response. And so you can test your cortisol awakening response where you collect right at waking, 30 minutes later, and then 60 minutes later through. It's a different Dutch test, but we can absolutely do it for people. And for her, I said, we call it a CAR, your cortisol awakening response. Your CAR is not good, it's blunted. And so let's use light to try to stimulate, to shut down the pineal gland from making melatonin and really get that HPA cortisol production. I also suggested she use what's called a full spectrum light box. Basically, it's buying full spectrum light bulbs, or companies just package them in a neat little, box that you turn off and on as she got ready in the morning. I wanted that full bright, full spectrum light in her eyes as she got ready to mimic the sunshine, to get her cortisol going so that she would feel more energetic and not rely so much on coffee. What was her 3-month follow-up? Well, she said in 3 months she felt like she was on the right path. Did she feel like she was an amazing unicorn? No. But she knew she was going to get there. And she also knows that some of it is lifestyle, some of it is job choice, some of it is just, it's just slow to change. So she said her anxiety, her depression, her sleep were greatly improved. Although on bad days, on very stressful days, it would make all those things worse. But she could then recognize it. She knew in her head it was estrogen related, it was VMA related, it was 5-HIAA related, it was all these related, and so she could handle it. She could recognize that and know what to do. She still had hot flashes and sometimes, and when she had her cycles, as expected. She's 48 years old. Unfortunately, hot flashes can come and go, and her cycles were still irregular. Again, they come and go as well at 48 years old. But she said, when I do get my period, my PMS and my heaviness is not nearly as bad. So the estrogen's moving in the right direction. She was making lunches the night before, and she was trying to spend 15 to 20 minutes eating it either in her classroom or in the teacher lunchroom just to help support her blood sugar. And we worked on ideas that if things were happening and she was missing lunch and she had to eat on the fly, that she could do things like protein bars and nuts or jerky. She started making chia pudding, which was something she found was super easy, and it was easy to bring to work, and she could flavor it and pull it out and eat it really quickly. Obviously, I don't encourage her to eat on the fly because that just, eating in fight or flight is definitely not going to help your digestion. But just baby steps, right? Baby steps in 3 months working with the teacher. Her hydration was still not that great, but again, as I said, life as a teacher, she's doing the best she can. And then by the time she got the genetics kit, and then did the genetics kit, and then mailed the genetics kit back, we are still waiting on the genetics report, which, as many of you know who have been doing the big genetic stuff, it can take months, right? They've got like a 9-10 week wait before they get that. And then copper and vitamin C, she had not. We were waiting on that as well, which does not take months to get back. It's just she had not gone to the lab to get them done. So we'll get there eventually. We'll find out what her copper is, but at least, you can consider just putting her on vitamin C because it'll help the adrenals. And if it's the cause of her HVA not getting to her VMA, it's super helpful. Vitamin C is a good one. Good antioxidant. So that's it. That concludes our talk. I hope you learned, one, some really great clinical pearls about hormones and perimenopausal women and organic acids and what you look for. And then two, I hope you just sort of got a great snapshot for those of you who are using the Dutch test. You can just use this, take this and take your knowledge that next step further, especially when adding in the organic acid markers. And for those of you who are maybe new and not familiar to the Dutch test, you're not sure, I hope it was a good sort of introduction as to what the Dutch test does have to offer.